Dear guests, good evening. My name is Uliana Chromyak, and I'm the Executive Director of Ukraine House Davos. On behalf of the organizing committee, it is my great pleasure to welcome you today. Ukraine House Davos is now opening its doors for the 6th time. No reminder is needed that Ukraine's economy in the midst of war is challenged by uncertainty, constant threat of rocket and drone attacks. And thanks to resilience of Ukrainian entrepreneurs, the heroism and determination of its people, Ukraine continues to thrive as a nation. We are grateful to the Ukrainian armed forces, doctors, rescue teams, volunteers, and many, many others who are relentlessly fighting our country's invaders for the 2nd year in a row. Dauntlessly determined to protect its own freedom and independence, Ukraine is fighting for a better democratic future for all of us. In remembrance of those who gave their lives for Ukraine, let us commemorate them by a minute of silence. Thank you. I would like to briefly illustrate the horrendous impact of Russian aggression against Ukraine since 24th of February until December 2023 in figures. % of Russian attacks have been against civilian targets. 1.2 thousand attacks on hospitals and medical workers. 2,420 damaged or destroyed educational institutions. More than 30,000 air raid sirens. 20,000 Ukrainian children forced into adoption in Russia. 112,000 Russian aggression-related and war crimes registered. 5.8 million Ukrainian refugees are officially reported globally. 1.3 million Ukrainians deported to Russia. But Ukrainians stay strong in the face of adversity for a good reason. Our brave soldiers have reclaimed 54% of territory once occupied by Russian forces. Our society and economy have mobilized in the battle for our freedom. The Ukrainian spirit remains unbroken. We see opportunities disguised in hardship. Ukraine will be triumphant in this war and emerge as a free and prosperous nation. We know that investing in our resurgence is an investment in a stable, secure, and thriving world. We are very grateful for the support extended by our allies and friends worldwide, which immensely helped Ukraine in its relentless fight. And it is critical to keep the momentum and further strengthen resistance against the aggressor as we head towards a hard-won victory. What are the opportunities to consider? Total cost of reconstruction and recovery, $411 billion US. 30% of Ukrainian infrastructure has been destroyed. 105 port infrastructure objects were damaged and need renovation. 30% of Ukrainian territory is mined. 20 of the critical raw materials, including lithium, cobalt, graphite, and zirconium, that will drive the green energy allocated in Ukraine. 400 million people are fed by Ukrainian agricultural exports. And as IT powerhouse, Ukraine has one of the highest levels of IT tech graduates per capita in Europe. This year's Ukraine House will host crucial discussions aimed at galvanizing international support of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. Ukraine House will bring together high-level government, civil society, and business leaders, amplifying the country's voice. Panels will focus on efforts required for Ukraine's strong recovery and the path towards its victory. Discussions will cover a broad range of topics, from strategic role of Ukraine in terms of global stability and security, to economic recovery starting now, to free trade, investment, and risk insurance, to frozen Russian assets, new defense technologies, the role of women at war, and much more. I would like to thank everyone who contributed to this year's event. Ukraine House Davos is annually organized by Western NIS Enterprise Fund, the Viktor Pinchuk Foundation, and Horizon Capital. And it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce to you the members of the organizing committee of Ukraine House Davos, the women who dedicated volunteering significant time to produce this event. Please welcome Yaroslava Johnson, the President and CEO of Western NIS Enterprise Fund. Svetlana Gritsenko, member of the board of the Viktor Pinchuk Foundation. And Lena Kozharny, founder, partner, and CEO of Horizon Capital. And we thank Viktor Pinchuk, who is not here, but who is the founder of Viktor Pinchuk Foundation. Hope he will join us in a minute. I would like to extend my gratitude to our gold sponsors. Temerty Foundation, for their determined support over the years, and personally, Christina Waller, please. Yeah. And Interpipe for sponsoring this year's event. Please, Vladislav. Separately, I would like to thank Mash McLennan for the panel sponsorship and Advantage Ukraine as the networking sponsor. Looking forward to our valuable time together over the next few days. Slava Ukraini! Glory Slava!
Згинуть наші вороженьки, як
Thank you. Thank you. Ukraine House will open with the expert opinion from Washington as Ukraine seeks to ensure support remains high on the agenda. Before the start of the panel, let us watch a short video.
Ukraine is now a nation at war.
Ukraine is fighting back. They are defending themselves.
If you care about freedom, if you care about democracy, if you care about our future, it's important for the world to stand with Ukraine.
Russian troops pulled back, letting in life and revealing huge trauma.
Ukrainians could be using them now to help assure our collective security for decades.
Tonight, a senior Ukrainian defense official declared that the entire region of the capital city of Kyiv has been liberated.
More resolved than ever to support Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression and atrocities.
When HIMARS showed up in Ukraine, it changed the face of battle.
And just a couple of days ago, it was liberated and claimed back by Ukrainians.
Ukraine has taken delivery of a sophisticated air defense system called NASAMS from the US.
France will supply the Krotal air defense system to Ukraine.
Presidential Drawdown Authority, or PDA policy, to ship Hawk equipment to Ukraine.
Tonight, euphoria in Kherson, a major Ukrainian city now free from Russian rule.
Now Ukraine will be the next nation to take delivery of America's Patriot missile interceptor system.
Some 50 countries have stepped up to help Ukraine defend itself and deter future threats.
Major demonstration of the effectiveness of its newly deployed Western air defenses.
The Ukrainian counteroffensive appears to be escalating.
The stock prices of the biggest U.S. weapons manufacturers spiked.
It will be very difficult for us to fight without your assistance, but we have no choice. This is very serious things because unfortunately we don't have enough power within our country to support our army, but we extremely need it. This is just a point of our survival.
And it is my great pleasure to invite to the stage our moderator, Yaroslava Johnson, President and Chief Executive Officer of Western NIS Enterprise Fund, who will introduce the speakers. Wishing you a productive discussion.
Good evening and welcome to Ukraine House Davos. I am honored to be a moderator on this panel focused on the view from Washington with esteemed speakers. The Honorable Oksana Markarova, Ambassador of Ukraine to the United States. Oksana, please. Why don't you sit here next to me, okay? Robert Portman, former U.S. Senator, Republican from Ohio, Distinguished Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Rob? Dan Runde, Senior Vice President and Schreier Chair in Global Analysis, Center for Strategic International Studies. And Natalia Bugayova, Non-Resident Fellow at the Institute for the Study of War. Natalia? My name is Yaroslava Johnson. I am President and CEO of the Western NIS Enterprise Fund since January 2015, and I continue on the board since my initial appointment in 1994 by President Bill Clinton. The fund has a vested interest in Ukraine's prosperity and future. The fund was established in 1994 by Congress with a $150 million grant and a mandate to invest and to have various programs. Since our inception, since the fund's inception, we have spent and invested over $188 million in 136 companies, which employed 26,000 people, and in the process unlocked $2.3 billion of funds for Ukrainian and Moldovan companies. In 2023, we received an additional $136 million grant from the U.S. government with a mandate to expand our investment in SMEs and to assist Ukraine in its recovery. Let me set the context for this discussion, the rationale for this topic. The rationale for this topic is that the U.S. was a steadfast supporter of Ukraine from the start of Russia's brutal multi-front invasion in February 2022. Yet mid-2023, support for Ukraine seemed to wane in Washington and later in Europe. The question from Ukrainians and friends of Ukraine is why? Ukraine has demonstrated fierce resistance, an outcome that the Kremlin clearly miscalculated. Nearing the war's second anniversary, Ukrainians are continuing to fight steadfastly, although they would have had greater progress had the weapons promised be delivered on time. Today's discussion will serve as an opportunity for experts with unique Washington experience to describe what is happening in Washington, summarize current U.S. assistance developments, clarify U.S. security interests in the region, identify possible Ukrainian security assurance, and provide an assessment of what Ukraine needs to end Russia's provoked brutality. Let's start our discussion with Ambassador Markarova. You have been Ukraine's representative in Washington for over 2 years, meeting with President Biden and officials in his administration, members of Congress, political, corporate, and civic leaders throughout the U.S. urging support for Ukraine. What is your assessment of the current situation in Washington?
Thank you very much, Slava, and we already thanked everyone who organized that, from organizers to sponsors. I also want to thank, before I start, to a very special person in the room, General Mark Milley and his wife, because he has been, because he has been irreplaceable in what we have been able to achieve during the very difficult 2 years of war. And thank you, General, for your service to your country, but also for your unwavering support to us. So where we are now, I think everyone here understands pretty much where we are now. We all Ukrainians understand that it's existential for us. There is not other options we can take other than to fight for our freedom, for our loved ones, but also for democracy, for something that we are fighting, and for freedom. And U.S. has been a supporter since not only day one of this war, but we have done a lot since President Zelensky's visit to the U.S. In 2021, when we started working on how we can deter Russia, so the sanctions packages, the military support, and everything else. And since the beginning, Congress was able to adopt 4 times the supplementary budgets to support us with not only weapons and assistance and all kind of security assistance and budget assistance, but also humanitarian, energy, and everything else. But now we're at a very pivotal point in Washington, D.C. I mean, nothing changed on the situation on the front lines. Russians still have intent to attack and kill us. We still have fierce determination to win and to defend not only us, but everyone else. It's a fraction, frankly, of defense budgets of our friends and allies. It's a lot, and we're very grateful for every support, but it's a fraction of defense budgets, given that we are fighting the common enemy, the enemy that threatens all democratic allies. And yet, since September, we see the discussions in Washington on the supplementary budget package, which we, frankly, needed in October. So one aspect of that, and I'm sure we will touch upon it here, is we fight for democracy, and US and Ukraine and Europe are democracies. And in democracies, you have discussions. And it's election year, and it's a very difficult election year. And so the question is how to go through the democratic processes, how to involve the stakeholders, how to continue discussing, because, again, we're not autocrats, but at the same time, how to make decisions quickly. Because Iran, North Korea, Russia, Hamas are showing that they're able to take quick decisions and help each other and do their horrible war crimes. Now, the question for democracies, can we do that? And I think this is one of the biggest discussions. Now, from my discussions on the Hill on both parties, I can clearly say that we still have very strong bipartisan support. Regardless of these very difficult discussions, regardless of the fact that, that the discussions are ongoing and we were not able to see the package adopted before Christmas and the discussions are still ongoing, but there is big progress there. And I also, as a positive kind of sign, want to say that there is no discussion about whether to help Ukraine or not. The discussion, as you know, is about a different issue, not related to Ukraine, but in the same package with us, the internal border issue, which is a national security issue, but not related to us. And I always say, really pray and talk to all of our friends and allies and ask them to find a solution there as soon as possible so that we can move forward and get the support that we need, because we need it yesterday. Now, the question is very important also that we need the security's existence, but we need the budget support as well. It's vital, because we need to be able to fight on the front, but we also need to be able to sustain the effort. And frankly, in order not to ask for money endlessly, to have the budget support now is actually to sustain our economy and to develop the economy and to enable the investments which will allow us to be self-sustainable. So to summarize in short, it's a very difficult time. It's, it's a difficult time because it probably will take some time, but hopefully not a long time. But at the same time, from talking to people in different states, we just visited with Senator Portman, his state. I'm traveling every month now. I can tell you that American people understand this fight and they support it, because we are fighting for the values on which America is based on. Now, how to get from this support, from understanding to the decision-making, and to get the support that we need translated into dollars and weapons, this is the challenge number one, and I really hope that we're at the end of that process and soon we will have the additional support to Ukraine.
Thank you very much. We'll turn to you, Senator Portman. You have been a staunch supporter of Ukraine during your 12-year tenure in the Senate, and you've visited Ukraine 10 times. Can you give us a status support, idea of the status in Congress is, what's happening in Congress with Ukraine support?
Sure. First, thank you very much for doing this again this year and for supporting Ukraine in every way. And Ambassador and I just had an opportunity to be in Ohio together, as she said. She did a brilliant job, and I think we were able to persuade a few people, maybe thousands. We touched a lot of people. Natalia, thank you for what you do. As some of you know, I think I gave 35 speeches or so on the floor of the Senate every time I used your material. Your maps are unbelievable. And thank you. It's to the war. And Daniel, thank you for your steadfast support. I mean, I would agree with what my friend Oksana Makarova said, which is that there is still a bipartisan group in the Congress supporting Ukraine. So as we talk about the fact that the funding has effectively ended and that we have trouble passing this supplemental, we have to remind ourselves that still a majority of Republicans in the Senate support funding for Ukraine. A majority of Republicans in the House, if we're brought up to a vote, probably would, but certainly a majority of the House does on a bipartisan basis. So sometimes when I hear the media accounts about this ongoing fight with the border policy and the Ukraine funding, I think they miss the point, which is there's still strong support for Ukraine, but there are concerns. And among those concerns are ones which we can address here tonight, and perhaps as ambassadors, all of you can be out there. There are members of Congress coming here to Davos, as an example. I'll be talking to them about Ukraine. I will tell you they're staunch supporters of Ukraine for the most part. But one is this notion of the spending at a time of big deficits and debts, $34 trillion debt. How do we afford this? One of the answers to that I know many of you probably have already used is that 7 out of 10 of these dollars are being spent here in the United States of America, creating jobs. In my own home state of Ohio, we've had significant funding, over $80 million of funding in Ohio to create not just new jobs, but expanding our defense facilities. So people sometimes think this is a check, and some people say a blank check, which I'll talk about in a second, given to Ukraine. It's not. It's typically a check given to an American company that hires American workers to produce American products. General Milley was extremely helpful during his tenure as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And what he will tell you is that part of what happens here is as we are taking from our own stockpiles, we are replenishing those stockpiles, which we should have done anyway. Many of these munitions, I think you'll agree, General, are close or at their expiration date. This is a time for us to rearm America. We needed to do it anyway, the arsenal of democracy. And so not only is the money largely going to American companies, American workers, but it's helping our own military to be able, at a dangerous and volatile time in our world affairs, to be able to be better prepared vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Iran, North Korea, and so on. Second issue that I hear, and this is one, again, that we should address aggressively, is lack of accountability for the funding. I will tell you, I wish there was the same accountability on domestic spending as there is on this spending. There have been 9 GAO audits. There are 20 different agencies involved with the IGs, the Inspectors General of the Department of State, Department of Defense, and also at the State Department AID office. There have been many audits. There have been many reviews, 42 to be exact. And guess what they have found? The money is being properly spent. Now, I'm for absolute accountability. We should do all we can. But my point is we're doing much, much more than the American people realize. We need to express that and be sure people know what's actually going on. Could we do more? Probably, possibly. The other thing I will say is that the military has done a terrific job. As General Milley will tell you, they are taking this equipment from all different countries, not just the United States, on the border with Poland. They're then taking it into Ukraine, and they're keeping track of it. They call it end-use monitoring. It is unprecedented. We have never done this before in this way. So we know where every HIMARS is. We know, by the way, the HIMARS are still there. And as far as I know, and this could change tonight, we have no evidence of the Russians acquiring or taking any of that equipment that we are providing to the Ukrainians. Isn't that amazing? I mean, this is, and by the way, there are plenty of Russian armored vehicles and other equipment that the Ukrainians have taken. You've seen them probably, including on the streets of Kyiv for everyone to see. So these are really important points to make as you talk to members of Congress. The final one that I will mention is that either you pay now or you pay later, and much more dearly. And this is a point I think that we miss sometimes. People don't realize that if Vladimir Putin has his way and he occupies Ukraine, there are 4 additional NATO countries that are on the border with Russia, countries with whom we have an Article 5 obligation. Also, if you listen to Vladimir Putin, and you probably should, because when he threatens something, he generally has done it, including invading Ukraine, which most people in Europe here never thought was going to happen in February of 2022. Yeah. But he said he was going to do it, and he did it. So when he says he's going to go further, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, Romania, certainly Moldova. We should believe him, right? There we have an obligation to provide American troops, American equipment. In my view, and again, General Milley has talked about this as well, we will be spending a lot more, and we will be putting our troops on the line to be able to create Fortress Europe again. We don't want to do that. Let's instead continue to provide the aid so that the Ukrainians can fight their own fight. They aren't asking for our troops. What they're asking for is the ability simply to defend themselves and, in a sense, to fight our fight, the fight of freedom for all of us. So my hope is that this border discussion will be resolved. That's what's holding up the supplemental funding right now. Once that is resolved, which I hope will happen, certainly we all want it to happen yesterday because the funding is needed, that then the Ukrainian funding will be able to move forward along with funding for Israel. And that funding will be able to continue the fight for freedom.
Thank you, Senator. I'm glad you mentioned this best-kept secret about how the aid comes to Ukraine, because even last week's Republican debate, one of the candidates, the two candidates, said that he was not going to approve sending money for Ukrainian bureaucrats to have pensions.
Yeah.
So clearly, the evidence is that 90% of the aid stays in the United States, in 31 states where military equipment is manufactured. So it's an important point to make to everyone that that the money is actually benefits America more than it does Ukraine. Ukraine gets the weapons from the stores, so from the warehouses.
Good point. Good point.
Okay. Let's Dan now. Okay. Dan, you have run the Ukraine Economic Reconstruction Commission, CSIS, and co-led a congressional delegation to Ukraine and Moldova this summer. And of course, you're a member of the board of the Western NIS Enterprise Fund with me. What more can U.S. be doing?
Great. Thanks, Slava. Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on this panel with such a distinguished group of people. The first thing I want to pick up on something Senator Portman said about this issue of understanding the consequences. I don't think we've fully connected the dots collectively about what happens, what the stakes are. I mean, I think we can be a little blasé in Washington. It's fallen off sometimes. It's fallen off the front page of the newspaper. It's unfortunately Ukraine is competing with other priorities, and so we need to understand. They are the shield of freedom. They are the shield of Europe. Vladimir Putin's not going to stop in Ukraine and all the places that Senator Portman was talking about. But also, if somehow this were to go badly, we're going to spend a lot more than if we. This is cheap. This is relatively. I know this. I know that's easy for me to say in my ivory tower at a think tank, but this is relatively cheap because we're going to pay a hell of a lot more if we have to station I don't know how many more American troops in Europe if this goes the wrong way. So I don't think we fully collectively have that's not been fully priced into the discussion. I think fully in Washington, and some of that's on folks like myself, and some of it's on. We just need to do a better job of that. So that's the first thing I want to say. I do think the second thing I want to talk about is the fact that we need to do a better job of getting members of Congress and congressional staff out to Ukraine. When they see it, they become converts. So this is not a criticism of the Biden administration. I understand what the Biden administration is doing. They're trying to keep people safe. They have a green zone. They've made some decisions balancing safety. But if you want to get a U.S. member of Congress to Ukraine, if I understand it correctly, a staffer from the State Department embassy has to leave Ukraine. And getting security for these folks is super difficult. So we need to find ways, whether officially or unofficially through institutions like my institution or others, we need to get congressional staffers out there. We took the first bipartisan group of Hill staffers to Ukraine. We had people who were anti the Ukraine. We did not take true believers. We took fence sitters. We took people who are a little anti, and they came away convinced. So there's lots of competition for making decisions about where we put people, time, and money. But I would argue we need to continue to educate staffers and get members out there. It is hard to get out there unless you're determined. And so that's the second thing I want to say. The third thing I want to say is we need to pass a bill So again, this is not a criticism of the Biden administration, but it was their idea to link the Ukraine aid with the border, with the U.S. border, which is like a super insoluble issue in U.S. policy. Now, I'm all for getting a solution to the border. So maybe in their thinking was, we're going to use this as kind of like a grand bargain. I think that's great. I hope that plays out. It's a hell of a gamble. And so I do think that we need to pass a bill, and we need to do so quickly. You've heard other people say this. But I think we need to think about two other things. We need to understand that this is, I hope and pray that 2024 is the year of Ukraine's victory, and Ukraine gets its entire 1991 borders back. They deserve it. They are inspiring. What has happened to them is outrageous. It's disgusting what the Russians have done, and the Russians need to be expelled from Ukraine, and they need to be punished. What we want at the end of this is for the Russians to take a 100-year timeout on trying to invade Ukraine. They may get drunk one night and say, oh yeah, I really want to do that again, but that was such a bad experience. You never hear the Russians say, I think I'm going to go invade Finland, right? There's a reason for that, right? We want them at the end of this to say that was a really awful experience and we're going to not do this anymore. But what that means is we need to take a very long view. We need to take a very long view. So we need to get through this bill, but we're going to need political will to accompany Ukraine for the next 10 years. So let me suggest something else. We're going to need something like an APAC for Ukraine. We're going to need to give hugs to those members of Congress who do the right thing, who don't have Ukrainian Americans in their district. There are 0 Ukrainian Americans in the 2nd District of West Virginia. Now maybe there's 2 or 3 and someone will come up to me and say, I'm in the 2nd District of West Virginia, but I don't believe it. There's not a lot of hugs there are a lot of Republican members who are not getting hugs for this. We need to figure out, we're going to need an APAC for Ukraine. And we're also going to have to educate American voters on the consequences of this. So we're going to need to have a different form of political mobilization. This is a at least 10-year project. So we're going to have to be, now, I hope the victory happens, but rebuilding is going to take a long time. And ultimately what we need to think about, what does victory look like? What victory looks like is for Ukraine to have the GNP per capita of Poland, the agricultural productivity of Canada, the manufacturing oomph of Germany, the Silicon Valley of Silicon Valley, because they got tech, the defense industrial base of Israel, so no one messes with them ever again, fully a member of the European Union, and a member of NATO. That's a 10-year project. That's a 10-year project. So we have to take the long view, and we need a political process to accompany it. We can have thoughtful seminars at think tanks like mine. I'm good at that, and my friends at ISW are good at that. The Atlantic Council, there's many fine places, but we're going to need to accompany it with other things. We need to educate Hill staffers and members, and then we're going to have to take the long view. And I hope and pray that 2024 is the year of Ukraine's victory, and then let's do the process of rebuilding the country.
Thanks, Dan. Natalia, you are a fellow at ISW, the go-to place for day-to-day technical understanding of what is militarily happening on the ground since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. What is the biggest challenge for Ukraine on the front right now?
Thank you, and it's a privilege to be here on this panel with so many friends of Ukraine. I would say that the biggest challenge right now is actually Western perception problem, and we really need to set the record straight because the ground truth of this war remains the same. It remains an existential war. It remains a winnable war if the West supports Ukraine properly. It remains very much in the US and European interest to help Ukraine win this war, because any other outcome that falls short of Ukraine fully liberating its territory and its people will not be a durable peace, but a temporary reprieve that will result in another war under worse conditions with the same escalation risks and with much higher costs. It also remains not just in Western interest, but very much in West's capability to help Ukraine win the war, because the capability of the collective West dwarfs Russia. And it has to be just aligned to a specific objective of actually helping Ukraine defeat Russia on the battlefield. So we're at a point where it remains a winnable fight, that the West should and can help Ukraine win. But the perception of these realities is shifting in the West, I think for two key reasons. First, it's under appreciations of the cost of failure and the risks that the West will incur if Russia is able to keep its gains in Ukraine. Secondly, is because Kremlin is actually investing massive effort in trying to manipulate us into actually walking away from our own interests. And this effort to target Western will, the bad news that it's working. I think the good news is that Western problem is actually less than Russia. For the West to achieve its objectives and help Ukraine win, what it needs to do is mobilize the existing and latent potential. For Russia, it's actually a massive capability gap. I think the UK has set a great example last week in Kiev of what it means to be solidly connected with their interests. And I think it's for the rest of the West to snap out of this paralysis, actually regain the agency and repurpose and mobilize the resources around the objective of actually helping defeat Russia. So I think the biggest challenge is not the reality problem, it's the perception problem.
Thank you. The Biden administration has provided significant amount of arms to Ukraine. As of now, of course, Europe has provided more. There is some perception in the public that the slowness of Ukraine's counteroffensive was a result of the foot dragging by U.S. and other European countries in providing the weapons when they were needed. What was the impact of this delay on the war and on Ukraine's positions?
I think momentum matters greatly in war, and I think Western aid was a step behind Ukraine's battlefield needs, especially in the winter of 2023. Ukraine has gone on two successive counteroffensive operations in the fall, and could likely have gone on a third if it was resourced properly. And I think that the failure to proactively invest in Ukraine's momentum is what, in part, it was not the only factor, but it was in part allowed Russia to get the reprieve, to regroup, to dig in, and create that defense in depth that is made it so extraordinarily difficult for Ukraine to advance.
I have a follow-up question. In recent months, articles in the Western media have talked about stalemate, about stalled activities on the front. Assuming these descriptive terms are correct, what should Ukraine armed forces do to regain momentum, to go on the offensive and to liberate the country?
First of all, I don't think the current situation is a stable stalemate. In fact, Western decisions can tip the balance in either direction. I think to break out of the stalemate, two things are required. One is a shift in mindset broadly, and the second are specific actions. I think for the mindset, first of all, we have to move away in the West from the approach to strategy. I think individual measures, as game-changing as some of them have been, are not a substitution for an actual strategy for how to defeat Russia. I think secondly, it's to the point of needing to be proactive and proactively invest in successive phases of Ukrainian counteroffensive, because it will take more than one operation to liberate Ukraine's territory and its people. And we have another window right now that we cannot afford to miss, because Russia actually hasn't got on the right side of the capability curve yet. And what I mean by that, it invaded Ukraine with insufficient resources for the military objective that it set out to do. It tried to close this gap through mobilization of its defense industrial base and force regeneration efforts, but it hasn't gotten fully to where it needs to be. With time, it may, and I think that's the window we cannot lose. I think in terms of specific actions, the key priority is needs to be to help Ukraine restore its ability to maneuver in the battlefield. A lot has been discussed about what systems are required, and it's well known, but Ukraine needs to increase its air power. Ukraine needs ability to destroy Russian AW capability so it can launch strikes closer to the front line. It needs long-range strike capability to separate the battlefield from Russian reserves. I think all of that is well discussed. We don't need to reiterate that, but that's a priority together with targeting Russia's capability, not just on but off the battlefield as well, including starving its defense industrial base from both cash. That means we need to start with half measures in terms of Russian energy, but also not amplifying it with access to Western electronics, for starters, and many other, I think, measures that are well discussed.
Thank you. I have a question for all four of you. Just before the winter holidays, there were articles in the press that Russia was ready for peace talks. Yet, Russia's massive missile and drone attack on Ukrainian cities throughout the holiday season proved these claims to be false, and that President Putin's initial objective to obliterate Ukraine was still in place. In your opinion, what could be the basis for any peace talks and when? Oksana?
Can you hear me or shall I take the mic? Yeah?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, it's really surprising that almost 2 years after the full-fledged attack and literally 10 years after Putin attacked us the first time, that people still believe in some fantasies that Putin's intentions changed. He tells us what he wants to do, and he didn't change that. Every time he speaks publicly, he says how he's going to destroy us, West, the names of the countries. He does on the battlefield, the war crimes, the attacks, the missiles, everything. And then he does not respond to any plausible initiatives like President Zelensky's peace formula plan, which clearly lays out a path based on the UN decisions already taken by 154 countries, 150 countries in some instances, on how to restore peace. Now, look, this is a very black and white situation. It was unprovoked, unjustified aggression. The peace can return to Ukraine very quickly. Putin stops the war and gets out from Ukraine, peace. Then we can work on justice, on everything else. And it's really surprising that when we are fighting this very difficult fight, again, what Natalia said very clearly, that it's not only not a stalemate, it's a very hot war on 800 miles or more than 1,000 kilometers front line, which is, as we discussed, longer than from Washington to Chicago. And we are able not only to hold this line, compare the two countries, but we were able to actually organize our own grain corridor, clear the Black Sea. Just yesterday, as you all know, another very valuable asset of Russians went down the plains. And it's just remarkable that when we actually show that it's winnable, we are devoted to this fight. We know that just with a little bit more assistance, but also very importantly, doubling down on sanctions, on isolation, we can win. And then instead of actually doing exactly what is needed to win, some people start discussing again, well, maybe Putin wants peace. Yeah. No, he doesn't. And I think that the faster we all accept that reality and realize that we just have to do what really works. Defend us, defend Europe, defend the values that we all hold dear. And just a little bit more on the sanctions and why it is very important. It's as important as missiles. So we started with, of course, right now in Washington, we all are focused on getting the supplementary budget supported and voted. But we have to keep focus on the strategic perspective. Right now, of course, we need this money desperately in order for Pentagon to be able to provide us with the weapons, and the State Department and Commerce and Treasury to provide us with all other assistance. But we have to also isolate Russia and stop them from being able to fund this war, but also to develop everything. Out of 330 Russian banks, there is still a handful, literally a couple of dozens, that under the full blocking sanctions. We should sanction all of them. All of them, literally. It's time for the sectoral sanctions, except for those which are still used, or some subsidiaries. And in each industry, we can go industry by industry and just tighten the sanctions to the point that they will really feel and cannot find this new balance, which they have apparently found. Plus, they have started buying and using, and we all have proof already, the North Korean missiles. That's a blatant violation of not only the, human decency and everything else, which they violate during the previous 2 years and 10 years, actually. But it's a violation of the UN decisions, which Russia actually supported and voted for. Let's do something about it. So I think it's time also for us not just to focus on what needs to be done now to sustain the assistance, but what can we all do to actually move further, to double down on our side so that they realize that they cannot sustain the effort.
Thank you. Senator Portman.
One of my great frustrations is when I hear people say, both in Europe and the United States, if we just backed off, we could get Putin to go to the bargaining table. And they say this on the floor of the United States Senate. There is absolutely no evidence of that. And I think we need to refute it in the strongest terms possible. The only way Vladimir Putin goes to a bargaining table is if he believes that we, being not just the West, not just Ukraine, but the freedom-loving world, is going to stand firm. And he respects military power. And he respects the ability to project force. And if we did have the Abrams M1 tanks from Ohio in action in a more significant way, if we did have F-16s in the air, if we did have TACOM missiles in place, which are longer range than the ones they have, if we did have munitions that are necessary right now, it would be much more likely that we could get a resolution of this crisis. But if we back off the sense that somehow he will come to the bargaining table, it just makes no sense historically with him, historically in terms of the world. In the 1930s, many people argued this as well, as you know. So I think it's really important that we push back hard on this notion that somehow there can be a peaceful end to this and we can all join hands and sing Kumbaya and walk away if we just back off. That's not how this is going to end. It's going to end when we win. And when we win, then militarily, then there's a chance of having a longer-term peace. It's not going to be easy. It never is with dictators like Vladimir Putin. I do think that we were on a better track in terms of exhausting their missile supply and their munitions before he went to Iran first. And those drones had come in hordes from Iran, have helped Russia quite a bit. And then, of course, North Korea. And as the ambassador said, Russia actually voted against North Korea being able to export military weaponry. And then, even though Vladimir Putin said he wouldn't do it, they're now purchasing weapons there. That's given them a little second opportunity to replenish their supplies. But that will be limited too at some point. And so we cannot back off. We cannot just assume that somehow if we back off, things will get better. They will get worse. And the consequences, in my view, will be that the United States will spend a lot more money and put our young men and women in uniform in harm's way in ways that none of us want to see. So I wish it were a simpler answer, but I think the answer is provide the Ukrainians what they need and win at the battlefield, and that way you can get to the bargaining table.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank you. Give the Ukrainians what they need. I agree with Senator Portman. I think Vladimir Putin is a liar. He's a liar. And you can't trust his word. Just look at his track record. He has lied and lied and lied. And so there is this comfort, there's this deception because it's been long. And I think in the West and the United States in particular, because of the Iraq War, because of Afghanistan, there's a temptation for the United States to want to take a sabbatical from global leadership. That's different than saying we want to turn it over to the Chinese to lead the world, but we'd like a vacation from global leadership. So this is kind of coming at an inconvenient time. And so a lot of the kinds of things that we tell ourselves, well, maybe if we just, back off, now he's ready, and he knows, he understands our weaknesses. I mean, he's a former KGB agent, right? I mean, so they traffic in lies, they traffic in disinformation, they interfere in our elections, they interfere in other elections. These are bad people. So ultimately, we're going to have to provide the weapon system. I know there's some grand strategy, I think, to like, we don't want to provoke Putin, and if we just give them this weapon and it goes this far, like I said, it's easy for me to sit in my think tank and think deep thoughts, but it just seems to me that they need to have all the weapons they can get. I do want to say something else. The Chinese are not Ukraine's friend. They are financing the Russian war effort just as much as the North Koreans and the Iranians. The Star Wars bar of thug countries are backing the Russians, including the Chinese Communist Party. So I want to make it very, very clear that, we need, that they are not Ukraine's friend. China is not Ukraine's friend. And so I do think, will say one other thing. I want to emphasize this issue of, I'm an American and I'm going to say this, that joining the European Union is like a really important thing. Like as part of like what peace looks like, being a full-fledged card-carrying member of Europe is a super important thing for Ukraine. What I say to American audiences, what would you have done to join the coolest fraternity or the coolest sorority in college? That's what joining the EU is like. And so the hazing that goes on, they have these 7 buckets of things that Ukraine's supposed to do and meet these requirements. And that is, there's not, we can write white papers, we can hold seminars, there's not enough foreign aid to kind of change the trajectory of the country. Joining the European Union is going to change the future of Ukraine. So it's really, really important. So what peace looks like and what winning looks like is that Ukraine is a member of the EU and ultimately, I think, a member of NATO. It may take a while longer, but we got to work towards that. But Vladimir Putin is a liar, and China's not Ukraine's friend.
Okay. Thank you. Natalia?
Yeah, I think on the point of talks and ceasefire, first, a reminder that Russia does not need a ceasefire or talks to end the war. In fact, it remains entirely the war of choice, and Putin can choose peace at any point of time. It should not be on Ukraine to signal willingness to talk. In fact, Ukraine has always chosen peace until the war was imposed on it. The West has always chosen peace to the point where it's self-deterred. Russia continues to choose war in part because Putin believes he can actually win at this point. I think secondly, any ceasefire or talks are not off-ramps for Russia. They are actually on-ramps for the Kremlin for a renewed attack on the conditions that benefit Russia. And we should remember that. I think third and final point, we should also remember that signaling of negotiations is actually an obfuscation method. It's part of Russia's information campaign that Russia uses as an offset capability to advance its goals beyond the limits of its real power. And this phoenix of the ceasefire narrative that has been resurging with specific intervals is part of this effort. And every time we let that narrative distract us from actual effort to target Russia's capability to sustain the war, we see an advantage of momentum on critical time to the adversary. So I think we should stop trying to shape the reality we do not control, which is Putin's mind and intent, and focused on targeting the reality we can control and shape plenty, which is Russia's capability to sustain this war.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I understand the General has a question? No. Okay, well, look.
Give us some thoughts. Put you on the spot here.
By all means.
Well, first of all, the microphone.
Here
it comes.
Well, first of all, thanks for all of you for doing this, and Ambassador, it's good to see you here. I think one key point that is not lost on anyone in this room, but needs to be remembered over and over and over again, is that Russia executed an unprovoked war of aggression. Ukraine was never, ever going to attack Russia. And Putin made it clear ahead of time that he was going to, and he did. And as Senator Portman said, it's worthwhile to listen to Putin as to what he will say. And I believe I don't think it was Putin, but one of his folks said just the other day that next is Poland, sort of thing. So I think that it's absolutely in the interest of the United States and Europe, not just Ukraine, to make sure that we prevail in this thing. There's a much bigger issue at stake. For Ukraine, it's an existential threat to its survival. And arguably for Europe, it's a significant and biggest war since 1945 on European soil. But I would argue that the real threat of this whole thing is to an international order that was established in 1945 as a result of World War II. We fought World War I and World War II, 30 years of unrelenting warfare across the globe that resulted in 150 million people getting killed. And it ended in 2 nuclear weapons being dropped on Japan. At the end of World War II, the powers that be, led by the United States, said we can't do this again. We can't have another war of that scale and scope. And so they established a set of rules. And those rules are what govern the world today. Like them or hate them, that's what governs the world. And since 1945, we haven't had a great power war. That's worth remembering. And we're in the 80th year of not having a great power war. That's important. The last 2 orders in Europe lasted 100 years. 1815, the end of Napoleon, to 1914 in August. And then before that was 1648 to the 1750s. So, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So the time is now, the place is Ukraine, to ensure that we prevent another great power war. And the way to do that is to make sure that the aggressor, Russia, fails in their war of aggression. And I think the support from Europe, the United States, and the international community to Ukraine is critical. That's military support, financial support, sanctions, diplomatic support, and the whole 9 yards. But it's really critical that Putin not succeed here. There's much greater things at stake for all of us, for the entire world community, I think, as to what this war is about. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about a much bigger issue. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you, General. I want to thank our illustrious panel, Ambassador Makarova, Senator Portman, Dan Runde, and Natalia Bugalieva for your informative and thought-provoking answers and questions, and for the discussion that I think will be important for Ukraine in the coming year, for sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank all the panelists and the moderator for this panel.
Yes,
thank you very much, and I do hope that we will definitely, increase the support of the yes, and we all will target our victory next year, and meet here to celebrate this. Yes, and this is the small to keep you warm in Davos. Please, this is our small presents for you. By this, I would like to wrap up this panel, and next panel will start in 15 minutes, so please stay. We have a great coffee downstairs in the networking area, and we invite all of you also to visit the exhibition. Also, we will have the networking reception in Ukrainian style, so please do join us today in the evening, and see you soon. Thank you. from UN Ukraine House Davos. So I am glad to announce the next panel, Galvanizing International Support, Now and Post-Victory. I would like to invite to the stage the moderator of the panel, Daniel Rande, Senior Vice President and SHRE Chair in Global Analysis in Center for Strategic and International Studies. Please welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm so appreciative that we're going to be having this conversation about galvanizing international support now and post-victory. I want to call up to the stage Secretary Penny Pritzker, who is the U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine's economic recovery. Please give her a big hand. Secretary, why don't you sit there, Madam Secretary? And then we're going to have Ambassador Hilbrun come on up, who is the Special Envoy of the President of France for Ukraine's relief and reconstruction. I think one of the, I'm not going to call it a silver lining because this has just been, it's atrocious and horrific what's happened. But in many ways, the Ukraine has helped save the Western alliance and helped remake the case for democracies versus autocracy. And I think one of the things we should recognize is that the United States and Europe have, through their efforts, have really gotten united in how they see the challenge of Ukraine, and I think that these are two really important representatives for us to have a conversation about this. So I thought what I would do is ask them each to just start with how they see things now and their remits and what they're optimistic about, because I think there's a number of things to be optimistic about, but also, there are lots of challenges. And then we can have a conversation about any number of different things. We could talk about the frozen assets and the opportunities in front of Ukraine and what Europe and the United States and others are doing to support the Ukrainian cause. So, Madam Secretary, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. And I want to thank Horizon Capital and Lena for, in particular, for inviting me to join you. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Horizon Capital represents exactly what Ukraine needs, which is a leading private equity firm that has, I think, about $1.5 billion under management. And it's backed by 40 institutional investors, which is exactly the kind of, I know it's a spin-off of WINSEF, which was a U.S. government development fund, but frankly now it's a for-profit effort, and that's really exciting to see. I thought I would share three things, if that's okay with you. The first is, I just returned from Ukraine. I was in Kyiv on Friday and got back to Krakow on Saturday. And it's a tough moment for Ukraine. And I think we all have to be really empathetic. They've had brutal holiday attacks and that are continuing. They've depleted munitions and they have a precarious budget situation. It's winter.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of uncertainty as it relates to the US and EU assistance. Now, we're giving them a lot of assurance, but they worry about a distracted international community and that the international community might lose faith. So I think we just have to put ourselves in the mindset of what Ukraine is facing before one starts to rattle off the good news. Despite all this, I think Ukraine is beating the odds. And there's a lot of work to do, but let me talk about three things. First, the economy. Ukraine continues to show modest but important momentum on the economic front. GDP growth last year was 4.5%. Investment was up 17%, and state revenue was up 10%, $4.4 billion, all of which exceeded expectations. Another thing is let's think about the Black Sea Grain Initiative. The Russians walked out of the Black Sea Initiative in July, and the Ukrainians went right to work. And by August, there was a new Black Sea corridor being created, first through the Danube and now down the corridor. And since August, 500 ships have moved through the Black Sea corridor, carrying over 15 million tons of exports. I know people in the back are enjoying themselves, but sorry, it's just hard to concentrate.
No, it's hard to concentrate.
A lot of news. But anyway, in December, Ukraine exported 4.8 million tons of food via the Black Sea, the new Black Sea corridor, which was more than was being exported through the Black Sea Grain Initiative that Russia agreed to. So the resilience, the adaptability is really amazing. And frankly, you know, the insurance market, Oliver Wyman went to work. They were able to put, with the Ukrainians, a hull insurance in place. And so the economy is active, which is something we have to remember. I think the second is we have to give the Ukrainians credit for the progress they're making on anti-corruption legislation, particularly in the run-up to the end of the year and the EU accession decisions. They know they have a lot more work to do. They've talked about another 250 reforms that need to be undertaken. We keep emphasizing it's more than just passing laws. It's about deep cultural shifts in a country that for hundreds of years has been facing a different direction. They need to do things like change their vetting standards of the people that they're putting in place, greater accountability, and a real enforcement in the agencies that are responsible for that. And the third is just the everyday resilience. You go to Kyiv and, you know, it feels like a European city. People are going to work, there are traffic jams, kids are going to school, music's playing, but there's also missiles at night, you know, which is now, fortunately, due to defense systems, they're not getting hit, but it's you know, we have to applaud the resilience. I think the call to action for, is we have to remind ourselves isn't just to Ukraine or Europe. It's about our joint commitment to international security. And you mentioned this at the beginning. And our joint commitment to international economic order and security order. And we need to hold ourselves accountable to all of us as governments to the commitments we've made to Ukraine. And that means the United States government needs to live up to its commitments of having Ukraine's back and obviously and fulfill our commitment on the supplemental. The private sector's commitment, you know, they don't have to make a commitment, but I would encourage people to go and see for yourself. Go understand what's going on, because when there's not war, there's going to be a lot of opportunity. And understand the government. You know, try to begin to understand, you know, the government, which I think is really important. And then I think for the international community, we also need to remain united. You know, it's easy for us to become fractured. And we have to be careful, because that's exactly what Putin would like us to do, is to start bickering among ourselves. So we'll talk more about all of that.
So I thank you for that. That's a great way to start this conversation. Ambassador, thanks for being here. Pierre, thanks for being here. So tell us from your perspective how you see things, and you know the region really well. You're a committed Europeanist, and you come from the EBRD, one of the real heroes of what's happened in Ukraine. And so, please.
No, thank you very much, Daniel, and great to be here, obviously, with Penny. We are working very closely together on many of the subjects you mentioned, and thank you, obviously, to Lena and to all the colleagues of Horizon Capital, which I had the chance to work with in EBRD, but also, obviously, in the last month, And I think we've done very exciting things, and probably will be able to continue on that path and announce very exciting things about development of the private sector in Ukraine, in very transformative sectors, which I think are really key, not only to maintain hope and to nurture the resilience Penny mentioned, but also to create also huge opportunities for obviously Ukrainians, but also for the world. And I think it's very important not to see that as a one-way process. You asked me also where I'm coming from. I'm coming from also a G7 country, which is a European country, so with probably a special responsibility linked to the fact that, and President Macron played this role also in pushing for the candidate status, for obviously the opening of negotiation, and obviously we'll continue to do that because we think that we have also, being also on the same continent, a special responsibility here. We have also a special responsibility because in fact, French companies are the first foreign employers in Ukraine, which is not always known. Because there are a lot of, obviously, big banks in Ukraine which have many branches, obviously in the retail sector, in the agribusiness, and in many other sectors. And in fact, these companies stayed, obviously, after the 24th of February and have been part of the resilience, obviously, of the country, rebuilding the branches of banks which were destroyed by Russians. And I think that gives us also a special responsibility in the future. I will not go back to the challenges which are immense, both from a political point of view and an economic point of view, because Penny, you pointed them very well. Also, about the good news, I think that has been noticed by everybody about the resilience, both on the macroeconomic front, but banking, also a successful initiative like which were pushed on the Black Sea, which are really fundamental. Also, I think on the military side, because obviously people are always talking about the failure of the counteroffensive, they always forget also the success and the courage which was displayed there, which are huge assets also for the future. I would just say what is needed now, I think, first is a sense of urgency. We talk about reconstruction, and I think this concept is sometimes very misleading because in fact, reconstruction is now and is happening, and at least I see French companies and I see European and American companies not only talking about reconstruction, but doing it. And I think we have to do that much more, and not thinking that we should look at Ukraine when there will be a peace treaty. That's an illusion, and by the way, it's very misleading. The second thing I think is a change in narrative. And I think we are always very much, obviously, covering the military aspect. But I think we are not covering enough, and probably it's our fault, but also media's fault, not to underline also the extremely, first, the intrinsic assets of the country, which are huge. But also the potential, the dynamic also, which is there. And I think we don't find in many continents. And I think this dynamism, this entrepreneurship is really fundamental. Last point is obviously on reforms. You mentioned that, Penny. I think what has been achieved also in the last 6 months with the perspective of enlargement, accession talks, is really impressive. And the question is now how much we sustain this progress, how we implement the reforms which were decided, and how we continue on that path.
Thank you. So it's been a privilege to be on the UNICEF board for 5 years. I was fairly intelligent about Ukraine, but at CSIS for the last 18 months, I've been leading this Reconstruction Commission, and we had a conference in September, and Secretary Pritzker was kind enough to come, and you helped sell a party. Thanks for being there. We really appreciate you being there. And we've done probably 30 seminars and 20 background papers. And my deepest thought after all that is we have to align all reconstruction of Ukraine with EU accession. Now, as an American, when I tell Americans, like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, that's your punchline? I'm like, yes, that's my punchline. And what I say to American audiences, Pierre, is, and I said this earlier, so I apologize for those who were here earlier, but what would you have done if you were in an American college to join the coolest fraternity or the coolest sorority in college? Joining the EU is like the coolest fraternity, the coolest sorority, and getting in is like hazing. And so you have 7 buckets of reforms you have to do. There's not enough foreign aid, there's not enough seminars, there's not enough white papers, there's not enough demarches that are going to change the trajectory of Ukraine. Joining the EU is going to it's going to impact the electorate, it's going to impact the political class, it's going to impact the business class. It's the only thing that's going to change the calculus and change Secretary of President was talking about the cultural shifts. That is a huge and deep cultural shift. So I think what President Macron has done leading on this, what France has done to lead on this, is historic. This is a huge ask. This is a big deal, right? To paraphrase President Biden, this is a big deal. This is a huge deal. And I think for Americans, we don't fully understand why this is important. But it's not just about resource transfer, but it's about the reforms and also about making Ukraine a full-fledged member of the Euro-Atlantic community. So it's really quite important. And so I think the fact that in December you all offered that process, could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think it's something that I know for European audiences, like, yeah, I know what European Union, not everyone here is a member of the European Union in the audience, and also who are watching online. Could you explain why that's important and how you see that process unfolding?
So, no, but thank you very much for your words. First, I think we should start from what people are expecting, in Ukraine. And Euromaidan was Euromaidan. So, obviously, Europe is associated with values, which we share obviously with all our allies, but also with a model of society which is about the rule of law, human rights, inequality, which is in a way not excessive and compatible with a competitive economy. So a form of society which is fundamental. So that I think is also one element which we sometimes forget before going to what is really an element which makes the difference, is a process where it's a process of transformation. And obviously the story and the trajectory of Poland, of the Baltic states, which have been able to transform themselves in a record time, and by the way, attract private investment by aligning with standards which are in fact reassuring also companies that they put money in a place where more or less the best environmental standards, financial transparency standards will be in fact the ones that they will encounter, is linked to the process, which is obviously sometimes burdensome. You have a lot of people on your back, and probably we know that as a member state of the European Union, by the way. But I think it's the only process which can be transformative, because otherwise it's one-shot progress, which are not in fact transforming a country or sector. So that's, I would say, the essence of the accession process.
Add something? Pierre, my impression of EU accession is it's both a carrot and a stick, in the sense that the carrot is you get to become a member of this club that that provides great opportunity for your population, your people. So it's an enormous carrot. The stick is you really have to conform. You have to conform to the values and the rules and the regulations, etc. So I find the word negotiation a bit overstated. And the more you think you're going to negotiate, I think the longer it takes to get into the club. And so I think that's as the Ukrainian government, I mean, the polling shows the Ukrainian people really want this. and they want the benefits that will come with it. And then the question is, how fast can the Ukrainian government actually make this culture shift? Not just adopt the rules, but live the essence of the rules. And that is, a lot of the work that I know your government's doing and our government is doing, is helping them live into the promise, if you will, not just what to do, but then it's more than just writing a rule down in your constitution or in your laws, but it's also living into it. And I think that's a realization that is important to have. Does that feel real
I would
to
say
you?
implementation is part of the story. So it's not
Exactly.
about rules. It's about making sure that they translate in reality, in sector by sector, and that's, I think, something where the idea is, even in the G7 platform, we are very much working together, is something where we should be united. So more or less looking at how rules are changed, how they are implemented, and what does it mean for the different segments of the society.
So, yeah, Secretary Pritzker, I think that's a great way to describe it, live into the promise that you were describing. And you talked earlier, Secretary Pritzker, about anti-corruption. And I think there are 7 buckets of reforms that that Ukraine has been asked to do by the European Union. I think 4 of the buckets, or I can't remember, you can remember, I think at least a significant part of the requirements have been around anti-corruption. And so it's a vector by which we can all collectively work towards helping our friends in Ukraine get to the right place. And as you said, live into the promise. I think that's a good way to capture it. I want to ask Secretary Pritzker that I saw a news story last week about a shift in the Biden administration's position on the frozen assets, the Russian frozen assets. I was hoping you might be willing to talk about that if you were able to, and if you want to, and I'm hoping also, Pierre, if you wanted to talk about that as well. This was in the press, at least. I don't know how.
Yeah, what I would say is I think there's enormous hope that the Russian sovereign assets could become an easy source of financing and a solution to, it's very hard, as you see in our government, the billions of dollars required. Yeah, most of the supplemental is military, but on the economic side, it's very hard. And so Pierre and I were talking about this earlier. I think one has to realize that the process, so the G7 has come out with a statement that in essence says, Russia should pay, and please, ministers, go back and figure out, is there some way that these thing we call Russian sovereign assets could be utilized for that purpose? Kind of, that's the way I translate it. I make it very simple in my mind. There's a lot between here and there. There's like 6 or 7 steps. You need a legal theory. You need enabling legislation. You need what's the governing process? Where are you going to spend if you had the money, where you might spend it, who gets to vote, who's in the process. And we have to remember that technically most of it sits in Europe, and it sits in a company that is a for-profit company. And so the assets are earning income, but that company's in the their job is to transfer assets around. So the whole thing is very complicated. And the first thing you know is a ton of lawyers need to get involved. And because whenever someone says legal theory, you have to know. And very, very smart people in the United States have studied this and are proffering legal theories. And the United States government is basically saying Russia needs to pay, and is there a way to get there? But no decision's been made. Yeah. And honestly, I think if a decision gets made, it's going to end up being a collective decision. I don't think you're going to see, the U.S. is going to go do something and Europe is going to do something else. Right. It's going to be a collective decision. And so on top of a lot of lawyers trying to sort this out, you're also going to have, everybody's got to agree. So I view this as absolutely a good use of resources between all of us to try and figure this out. But I think it's a misperception to think this is going to be a panacea real fast.
Or it's going to happen next week.
Well, for sure it's not
It'll
happening
happen
next week.
Right.
And that's not happening. And then you can have a legal theory, but then that affects how you actually use the money and what, there are a lot of things that have to be figured out. And the good news is what the G7 has said to itself is, and the leaders, is go work and try to figure that out. So there's real work going on and real effort and real intention. But we're far from a conclusion.
Thanks for that. Pierre, do you want to add?
No,
is that unfair?
That's completely fair, and it's not only fair, elegant, I would say, in the way we are working together on that. I think there is no miracle solution. By the way, it should.
And you agree, it's not going to happen next week, right, Pierre?
And it will not fill the gap immediately, which we have more or less to fill through our own means, financial means, military capacity and all that. By the way, the private sector also funding of Ukraine is sometimes seen as something which will be gigantic immediately. It will not. So we have to prepare the ground so that the private sector, that kind of solutions linked to Russian state assets can be mobilized over time, and that we can use that to support Ukraine over time. But I think, 200 out of the 300 billions are in Europe, very concentrated in one or two countries. Yes, Belgium. We are working extremely actively in Brussels. And by the way, the Commission has made a proposal on the 12th of December about using these revenues. They are not ridiculously small. We are talking about 15 billion euros over the next 4 years.
This is the interest. This is
yes,
the interest
exactly.
on the money.
And it's only what we call windfall profits made by Euroclear, which is the depository of Russian assets, the central bank. So this is significant money, and I think obviously it can have systemic impact on the euro. So these issues have been to be looked at carefully, and I think at the end, and Secretary Blinken, like Janet Yellen, were very clear in the fact on the fact that there should be a G7 more or less common position on that. Also taking into account the technicalities and legal aspects you mentioned, Penny.
So I want to come back to this issue of the private sector, because I think the EBRD, the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, there have been a series of instruments, of development finance instruments. AIDs played an important role. Various bilateral aid agencies in Europe, the European Union's different agencies. Can I start with you, Pierre, to talk about this? But I want to particularly highlight what I think the EBRD has been total heroes in this. They've been total heroes in this. So could you just talk a little bit about these institutions? I know you used to work there, so I know you can speak to them. But I also know, Secretary Pritzker, both in your past life and now in this new public service role, you're seeing the role that they're playing, and love to hear your thoughts on this.
So I will not champion EBRD because I don't need EBRD. Has championed obviously Ukraine agenda in the last 2 years, especially, but in fact for the last 30 years. Obviously, this has been recognized also by EBR shareholders, US being the first of one, but obviously European ones, showing that there was value for money, if you want, using EBRD for that, and the capital increase which just happened is just the recognition of the impact the bank had. Obviously,
like the special capital increase.
Yes, exactly. Honestly, we've done our fair amount of the job as shareholders, obviously not only through capital, but also through guarantees in the last 2 years, which allowed the EBRD to do more. We've put, as France, for example, €500 million in the last weeks for IFC, BRD, and EIB to cover the risk also of their operation and to use the leverage these institutions have in triggering investments in Ukraine. I would say this is each institution consider that we've done more or less what humanly could be possible. I think there are also areas where we can still work on, the combination of insurance, by the way, of investments, but also of people going to Ukraine, and which is linked to obviously investments. We have to continue to work on the best way to de-risk investment in Ukraine, and I think that's also an area where we can make progress. Also, touching the SMEs, which are obviously, and Ukrainian SMEs, which are the backbone of the economy, and I think that also requires probably special attention and probably also risk-taking behaviors of each of these institutions backed by shareholders. And that's very much, something which we're working on. There are proposals there. Also proposals of IFIs and these institutions really working as a system. So on the same pipeline according to the different mandates and making a difference in the areas of specializations of each institution.
So Secretary Pritzker, I'd be curious about how in your work you've been intersecting with the USDFC, USAID, and the EBRD and others, and how you see them, the role that they've been playing.
Well, I think what we've tried to do is connect the knee bone to the shin bone. In other words, to make sure that the investments that USAID is making are related to things that can help the economy in Ukraine get its earliest benefits, if you will. And the same is true with DFC. I mean, they're doing a lot to support SMEs. And they're being extremely creative where they can't do direct lending or do certain things. They're funding into banks that are active on the ground. So I think they're, all of this, one of the things that President Biden wanted to make sure and asked me to get involved in is just make sure that it's not every aspect of the U.S. government doing it for themselves, but how does it all fit together to add up to ultimately helping reconstruction get going as quickly as possible. And frankly, I mean, as we've talked about, all of us believe reconstruction needs to start now and the effort needs to start now. And what do I mean by that? There's just foundational work that has to happen. That whether it's infrastructure that is necessary to expand market access, or it could be things like war risk insurance that we're talking about, or how are you going to make, what mechanisms are going to allow that Russia is actually going to pay for support, or, security. What kind of security can be guaranteed today so that if I do invest in something in Ukraine, I'm not I'm going to lose my product or lose my people or lose my services. And people is a big issue, right? Obviously, that's the first issue. But, if you go to do a business and either new or expand in Ukraine, it's difficult to get, what about benefits or, workers' comp, or what about, just basic insurance we all take for granted. So there's a lot of foundational work, that, for example, alternative dispute resolution. How are you going to do dispute resolution as, while Ukraine is committing to reform its courts, in the meantime, what do you do? That may be something you ultimately tie to EU accession, right? But the process of EU accession will get the court system in place. So, anyway.
Good. Okay, so let's talk about one of the things I've been really encouraged by, that the economy of Ukraine grew this past year, and it's expected to grow next year. There was a grain deal, and there's hopes that many folks are going to return, that there will be a significant number of folks returning. And so could I ask you each to talk about there's a lot of challenges, and we've talked about some of them, But what are some of the near-term opportunities for Ukraine? Because I know that's part of that you think about these things. And what are some of the near-term opportunities? Because I agree that, Secretary Pritzker, we need to be thinking about reconstruction now. We need to be working towards that, leaning into that future now. So I'd be curious how you each see the near-term opportunities. Maybe I'll start with you, Pierre.
So you mentioned people returning to Ukraine. I think this question about human capital is really fundamental, because I think nothing is possible without people being able to work and to contribute to that agenda. So I think everything which can be done, even to redirect the support we've been extending to Ukraine in each of our countries, but thinking if part of that can be used into supporting these bright women and men who are working, sometimes for some of our countries, feeling that very comfortable because they are extremely skilled. They sometimes meet the gaps which were identifying or demographic challenges some of Eastern European countries had. I think we should do that. And that's not easy, but I think that can lead to obviously a short-term boosts in the near future to Ukraine. The second thing, I think we need good, cases where there are concrete projects of investment in Ukraine, but now. So we're not only thinking about projects in the next 5 years, and I think, at least what I see in France, is you have companies, private investors, who are very close to making investment in the country. And I think the day where they will appear, they will be publicized. I think that changes the mind of other investors who think, oh, that's completely impossible during a wartime because there are no security there. And I think proving by example the case, I think that Ukraine is more or less a place of opportunity now is very important. And that requires efforts on our side, that requires efforts on the Ukrainian government side, and we are very much working every day on that. But that has, I think, a signaling effect, which is really crucial in the current time.
Secretary.
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. I think the opportunities, if you think about the tech sector's growing. And there's enormous talent in Ukraine. And and that's something, all you need is connectivity in order to do. And so I would say, that's an early in opportunity. I think that as security across the country gets clearer and clearer as to, really making that more obvious. Those are areas, so geographically, once you have greater security, then you've got, there's an opportunity. And so, and as it relates to people, I think that it's tricky, right? Because you have a number of diaspora throughout Europe, some of which are happy, and some countries would like those folks to stay. And so it's going to become a question of feeling it's secure to go home. I'd rather be home. I've got a place to live. My kids can go to school. They're not going to be attacked, and I can get a job. And so that's the part that is going to need to be all come together in order, I think, to help folks return home. But I think there's a huge amount of loyalty among the citizenry of Ukraine. And so I think that, as things evolve in the country, hopefully folks will return.
So one of the things I'm going to take away from this conversation, something you said earlier, Secretary Pritzker, about there's enormous opportunity in Ukraine. And you also said this as well, Pierre. This is a country of immense opportunity. And I learned a lot from my friend Lena Kazarny, who told me it's hands, brains, and grains, right? So manufacturing, tech, and agriculture. And so I think there's a lot to be optimistic about in spite of all the many challenges in front of Ukraine. And I know that it's really important, the support that Europe and the United States has been providing.
Can I lean into that a little bit? I also think in defense. I mean, in other
Yeah.
words, the defense,
Amen.
first of all, the Ukrainian military is on the bleeding edge of living into what modern warfare looks like.
Unfortunately, yes.
And they're unfortunately, and bleeding is probably a bad word
Yeah,
to have used, but and so forgive me for that. But and the creativity, the
Yes.
ingenuity, the innovation that's occurring is extraordinary. Ukraine has a history of having been a military exporter, so there is absolute capacity and capability there. And I think that is an area of opportunity that's sooner rather than later.
So I'm planning to do a conference next fall on reconstruction, but I also had hoped to put something together specifically on the defense industrial base, and the Biden administration did recent conference, but I keep thinking that maybe there'd be some use in us doing something at CSIS on the defense industrial base specifically, if that was, I don't know if that's something that, it strikes me as.
Never hurts.
Never hurts. Okay, so I think that's, so I want to call on, yeah. So I want to call on two people, and I'm going to give, and then I want to ask two people, I want to hear from two people, and then I want to ask each of our panelists to give just 1 minute of parting thoughts. So I want to hear from Lena Kazarny, and I want to hear from Mr. Sharma, who's here. So could I get a microphone? Could we get a microphone up here quickly? Okay, thank you. First, Lena, introduce yourself. Everyone needs to, you don't need an introduction, but just remind everyone who you are for the television audience as well, please.
Thank you very much, and I just want to say thank you so much. Special Representative Pritzker, Secretary Pritzker, and Special Envoy Pierre Hebron. You are champions. You are doing such heavy lifting, coordinating all of these efforts, setting forth the messages that are very important on the Ukrainian side, but also on the international side, and also for your steadfast belief in the private sector. And you are champions of the private sector. You come from the private sector. You are going hand in hand with the private sector, and we really appreciate that. So look, my belief is any way that we can support your efforts, let us know. As chair of the board of American Chamber of Commerce, we are very grateful for the support, Secretary Pritzker, for the championing. It's very important because ultimately 60% of Ukraine's budget is paid for by taxes. It's a patriotic duty. Folks feel very important. The resilience on the ground is immense. 600 members of AmCham, $50 billion invested, and a third of them have lost people in this war, which never should have happened. And we believe that Ukraine is strategically important. We feed 400 million people. We have sectors that go beyond, as Secretary Pritzker mentioned, defense is critical. Energy, telecom, tech, ag, manufacturing. And what I want to say to everyone in the room, there's a lot of U.S. companies here who are looking to expand relationships with Ukrainian entrepreneurs and companies. There's a lot of European companies. And thank you for the support, the guarantees, the backing, the activization of DFC, of EIB, EBRD, IFC, because that work is critical. I know from raising a fund, we've raised the largest fund for Ukraine, 328 million, 328 million, soon it will be 350, but we started off without the 10 million from Westness, 35 times already, without the backing from EIB, 25 million euros, DFC, 25. We could not be already backing entrepreneurs now. We put $50 million to work in the last 6 months. And between us and Western and AS Enterprise Fund, we have $500 million to put to work right now in Ukraine, and we're doing it. Thank you for all of your help, because of you and the support to the private sector. We really appreciate it.
Mr. Sharma, please.
Good evening to everybody. Thank you, first of all, for your strong support to Ukraine. I think everybody understands that it's all about the private and corporate sector when we speak about the real full-fledged recovery. And what will be the two main obstacles that we need to overcome? The first one is about military risk and this, I would say, starting finance, but the pure private capital will not commit, only the mixed capital from the international financial institutions, from the export credit agencies, from all those sources that can really put the shoulder at the first stage of the recovery. I think these are absolutely critical instruments to start up all those projects. And the instrument to ensure the military risk, because if you speak to any conventional industry, not maybe the tech, but the conventional industry, the military risk is like 90 to 80% what really stops of really touching some of the opportunities. And the second part is the specific deals, specific transactions, because that really builds the trust, the belief that this is possible, and it creates the FOMO effect, because everybody speaks about the unique opportunities, but everybody fears to try. If you see 1, 2, 3 big transactions, the other starts to look. And I really hope that there is one very specific deal that everybody is working on now, that it will materialize in the next weeks, maximum months, which will be the real big multi-100 million startup for this run and the Ukrainian recovery. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, please. I want to give you each a chance to have just a closing thought before we close this out. Madam Secretary?
Well, I'll just say, first of all, thank you for inviting us. And, you know, this is, my closing thought is really one of, we're committed to Ukraine, and nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
Amen.
And I want to give reassurance to Ukrainian people that the American people and America is there for you, even though our politics and democracies can be very complicated.
Messy, yeah.
I would just say that Ukrainians are the best assets for the country, and
Yes.
I think that we've seen that obviously in the last 2 years, but we've seen that also, the vitality of the civil society. Sometimes I'm going with young colleagues to Ukraine who are working in the French civil service, and they dream of working in the Ukrainian civil service because they think that it's more dynamic, it gives more hope to them than sometimes in old countries, which sometimes are used to peace, to a comfortable lifestyle. So I think that's, I would conclude by saying that that's the best asset of the country, and we have a responsibility, I think, in building on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you. This is great.
I know they...
Yes, thank you very much. It is a pleasure having you and an honor to having you in our house. So as to stay warm in this winter weather, here are some scarves for you to get warm.
Thank you very much. That's beautiful. That is lovely. Thank you.
Should we get a picture?
Yes, please.
Okay.
First.